Hi there again. In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about why are indigenous languages disappearing? What are some of the factors that we can attribute to these minoritized languages? So there we go. So anyways, just to start with, for those who haven't been to Oaxaca, as you can see on the map that I'm sharing with you, Oaxaca is in the most southern states of Mexico, so that's where Zapotec is spoken, and also in many parts of the U.S. We'll get into that in a little bit. And Oaxaca is part of this region called Mesoamerica, where we can find a lot of the indigenous languages spoken in the America. So if you guys can see, like you have a Maya zone and Aztec zone, and other languages and peoples that we find in Mesoamerica. And so Mesoamerica goes from a little bit up central Mexico to all the way to Honduras. So there we have it. And if we think about indigenous people in Mexico, you know, I just show you guys the map of the of Mesoamerica, and also if you look at the map of Mexico, you find that you know, it still holds true at this that indigenous communities inhabit most of the what's central Mexico, southern Mexico, and especially in Oaxaca, as you can see there. Right now, there are around 68 ethnic groups that exist in Mexico, and something that's interesting about who is indigenous and who isn't, it's really interesting in relation to the US, because in the US it's about blood, right? But in Mexico, most of the time it's about the government recognition. For example, in Oaxaca or in Mexico last year, they changed the Mexican constitution to recognize Afro-Mestizos, for example, right? So if you are not recognized by under the Mexican Constitution as a group, and then you don't exist. So that's the way one is classified. Although more and more people are choosing to classify themselves, self-classification, as indigenous communities. So, all right. So here we have Oaxaca, and on this map that you also can find in your book, you can see the different ethnic groups that that exist in Oaxaca. So there we have, I mean, for exception of the Afro-Mestizos, we have the indigenous communities represented on this map. There are 16 different ethnic groups, and the largest one, as you guys can see, I mean, not just on the map, but also in terms of numbers, it's the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs are the largest ethnic groups in Oaxaca. And again, when we speak about Zapotec, what do we really mean in terms of language, in terms of culture, right? That is not one group, although we talk about Zapotec, right? But in terms of language variation, it's much different. So think about Zapotec in terms of Romance languages, right? That when we speak about the Romance languages, we speak about what? We speak about French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. So there is no such thing as something called Romance language. So in that sense, I think about it. So just equate Zapotec as Romance language. So even though whoever named this Zapotec didn't take into consideration these differences that exist. So Zapotec, it's a family of languages. And in terms of culture, it is pretty well accepted. There are four major culture and regions in Oaxaca, as you guys can see on the map, where you have up north, you have Zapotecos de la Sierra Norte, which is the highland, and then, of course, the Zapotecos del Valle, and then we have Zapotecos de la Sierra Sur, Zapotecos del Istmo. So those are the four major regions, and also cultural groups of Zapotecs in Oaxaca. So why are some of these languages disappearing? And I think that the threat against indigenous language and people, it's pretty much, you need to understand it in the historical concept since the foundation of Mexico as a nation state, that pretty early on, right after the revolution, there was an Indian problem that a lot of intellectuals and the elite, the politician, saw this idea that they had to face this, what they call the Indian problem, right? Because when they're looking at the US and we're looking at Argentina, for instance, they saw, and there's that these countries, and these new countries were becoming modernized, and so they started thinking about themselves and question like, what makes Mexico a poor country, an underdeveloped country? And they basically say, hey, it gotta be those indigenous people. So this has been a constant topic throughout Mexican history. And if you think about, right after the Mexican Revolution, there came ideas that was first presented by Jose Vasconcelos, right? This idea of the cosmic race, that pretty much the idea was, okay, so what is Mexico what makes Mexicans, if you will? So he felt that it is something unique to Mexico, that given the hundreds of years that Spaniards and indigenous people have lived together, that the mixing of the two races have created a totally new race, what he calls the cosmic race, the mestizaje, right? The mestizo people. That's what came out of the conquest, the Spanish intrusion. How can it not happen after hundreds of years? So that's his rationale, at least, this idea of la mexicanidad, right? So pretty constant in Mexican history. The indigenous people have been pushed aside, or have been forced to integrate into the larger Mexican ideology. And it's just not elites, it's also politicians. For example, in 1940, there was the first Indigenous Congress in Mexico, right? Well, actually, it was a speech for the President Lázaro Cárdenas to convince Congress to approve some of the some money in the creation of what it became Instituto Nacional Indigenista. And he said, our indigenous problem is not to conserve the Indian as Indians, nor to Indianize Mexico, but rather to Mexicanize the Indian. So, I mean, that was his model, or his intention, through different mechanisms, to different policies, that the state needed to intervene to make Mexico a modern country. So in a way, as Ewan kind of puts it out there, it is this idea to glorify the past. They're in the past, they're no longer here with us. So let's recognize their greatness, but not the actual people. And if you guys have read Vasconcelos, right, that's his whole point. that everybody's equal. Yeah, there. Once upon a time, there were a lot of Indians here, but now you can only find them in museums and books, but they're no longer alive. So it's no wonder that a lot of people talk about ancient history of the indigenous people, indigenous um, languages were or languages. It's like, okay, an ancient language, the Zapotec or Maya is an ancient language, but it is out of the ignorance, I think, that they don't really see this connection of, at least don't see us, uh, those who continue to speak this language, as real people, right? That we no longer exist, because how can we exist if we are in the past? So anyway, so Zapotec language has survived, for hundreds of years, and there are over 400,000 Zapotec speakers today. So to be exact, it's about 450,000 Oaxacans back in Oaxaca. And um, unfortunately, more and more communities and people are shifting to Spanish in more contexts. Even the communities like kids who once upon a time they might have used Zapotec, but now given that sometimes it's cool to speak Spanish, right? So now they choose to speak more Spanish, even with the communities that I've seen in my own community. So that makes all Zapotec varieties to be in danger of disappearing, because there is less and less speakers of these varieties, right? And in some cases, many varieties are critically in danger, where people who are probably 40s, 50s, or even 60s, they are the only ones who speak a variation of these languages. So let's think about it. If Zapotec is not being transmitted to the new generation, I mean, eventually the language is gonna die. So, and in a way, you guys, by taking this course, you're gonna be helping to a degree maintain the language alive. And also, one thing to remember when you guys might be tweeting is that a lot of Zapotec speakers actually don't feel comfortable in writing their language, because they feel like, okay, if we don't have an orthography, how are we going to write? But I mean, it is not true, right? It's just this idea that we have that there has to be an orthography. So I just, what I tell students or what I tell young people is like, just write it, just whatever you want to write it, just do it. So I think that's the very first step in order to start thinking about Zapotec literature, for example. Just write it, and then we'll deal with the orthography later. So, but also, the discrimination that exists against a lot of speakers, that also has a negative impact, because people don't want to be seen as something less than, speaking a less than a language. So I think that we need to really instill in them that any language is just Zapotec, or any indigenous language is the same as Spanish, English, or any other Western or language that's spoken around the world. So, but unfortunately, a lot of speakers feel that they don't want to expose themselves to racism and discrimination. At the same time, they don't want their kids to go through that if they went through that discrimination themselves. They want their kids to have better opportunities in life, right? So it is understandable, because many times I hear young people say, oh, it's my parents' fault that I don't speak the language, but I think it is more complex than that, because we need to understand under what circumstances that person did not want to teach their kids their language. And many times we see the Spanish or English, for example, more in terms of economic gains. So if you speak Spanish or if you speak English, right, you have better opportunities. But and then there is this choice that one has to make. What do I teach my kid? How do I go about it? What are the impact of teaching my kid an indigenous language? So I do think that those are very valid points and questions, but how do we begin to think about language maintenance if we don't see the value in the language? So I think that's for a long conversation, but within this context I'm talking about, it's that where we are here now, that offering this course, and hopefully that you guys would help get the word out there, and also by participating, by tweeting, by seeing Zapotec with a different eye, that it's something of value, not just an indigenous language that it's in the past, right? So I really think that you guys will make a great contribution to the maintenance of language. As I said, these are some of the issues that Zapotec and other indigenous languages confront. The fact that they're not taught in school, and they lack scientific, mathematical, educational value. And thus they're not spoken in public places such as school or other, unless the community, and that's the language they speak there. But in non-Zapotec spheres, you don't, Zapotec is not used. And also this idea that Zapotec is seen as a traditional and changing and linked to the past, and having little value or no value in a modern society. That Spanish, as I mentioned earlier, that's modern, it's full of opportunities for economic, social status gains, and ultimately, by the fact that people think that indigenous languages have no value, they just also use this idea of, oh, they're not real languages, they're just dialectos, right? Dialects, which is not the proper terminology. I mean, a dialect, it's just a variation of a particular language. For example, the English that is spoken in the South and English spoken in California, right? Those are dialects because you can talk to each other, you can understand each other, but they're not different languages. So by saying that indigenous languages are these dialectos or dialects, you really minimize the language and create helping people think that their language is not real a language. And a lot of people who speak an indigenous language actually use the term, which we really need to change. And with your help, again, we'll start to do that. So anyways, if you guys ever go to Oaxaca, you will see great construction that early Zapotecs left, such as Monte Alban or Mitla we have here. So when we talk about, the Zapotec, it has no value in terms of mathematical. And then we need to think about, okay, so how did these great constructions were created and also planned? So there must be some ways that they use through math and city planning, everything that takes into building a city. So, just we need to think all these concepts or rethink them. So anyways, I hope that this little background in terms of the language and what's happening with languages, Zapotec especially, help you understand a little bit more the value of language maintenance. And one of the last thing I would like to say is that Zapotec is not only been spoken in Oaxaca, but also through migration. Oaxacans and Zapotecs have been coming to the States since 1940s, at least as far as I know, to work in the US. And now there are more than 2 million Oaxacans living in the United States, and especially in California and Valley Zapotecs. They're pretty much concentrated in the greater area of Los Angeles. So we can even find people who speak Zapotec in LA, in a modern society every day with their families. So just keep that in mind, and we'll come back to this, and then the next lesson, I think that we'll be discussing more in terms of the language itself and how do we go about it in trying to learn it. So I hope this helps.